Welcome to the Sorge podcast, where we explore Sikh and wider South Asian history, art and philosophy with historians, artists and researchers. So today I have the pleasure to talk to someone I have been wanting to host on the podcast for some time and has come up in a number of previous podcast conversations for the influence this guest has had on not just myself, but on other people that I've spoken to. So without further ado, today I have the pleasure to talk to Amandeep Madra, founder of the UK Punjab Heritage Association, co-author of 5 books including gems such as Warrior Saints Volume 1 and The Golden Temple of Amritsar Reflections of the Past, as well as being awarded an OBE for services to Sikh and Punjabi heritage and culture. So now the introduction is out of the way, I would obviously love to just start by saying thank you for making the time to do this. And I would also love to start with the question of your family background, your upbringing, your education, kind of how did you go from wherever kind of your ancestry came from to where you are today?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Thanks very much for having me on, and thanks very much for that very generous introduction. I've listened to some of your podcasts already. I found them really interesting. In fact, I'm going to cheekily involve them in one of the book club conversations that we had a few weeks ago as well. So I really like the work you're doing, and all power to you. I think this is going to be a really valuable resource for the future. What's my background? How did I get into it? Gosh, I don't really know. I didn't have a light bulb moment as a child growing up, that's for sure. I didn't grow up in a particularly... I was born in Southall, but I didn't, we didn't live there very long. Moved to Northolt, just another part of that bit of suburban northwest London. I didn't really have too many Sikh friends growing up, but I think if there was a turning point, it was at university. It was quite late, isn't it? A lot of people get the bug a lot earlier, but for me it was at university, and I read Khushwant Singh's 2-volume book on Sikh history called A History of the Sicques, which most people know, and I was just floored by it, because if the only route to learning Sikh history is that which you hear at the Gurdwara, or that which you hear from your parents as those kind of, I don't want to be rude, but those kind of fairy stories, those very polished stories where the Sikhs are good and the Mughals are bad, and we are often victims, but always victorious, and we always have the moral high ground, etc. Khushwant Singh's History of the Sicques, which isn't, let's face it, isn't the best rendering of Sikh history in the world, but it's a really, really good one. It's just an eye-opener. It reads like a novel, because there are characters and they're real, and there are moral questions, and it just feels a bit mucky. Everything's a bit grey. It's not quite as crisp and clean as you were led to believe. And I think that's really interesting, particularly for those of us that frankly have grown up with that kind of Western mindset where you're encouraged almost to be skeptical, or at least question authority, or question the received way of doing things. And I just found it absolutely fascinating. So then I read every other book that I could get on Sikh history, Sikh religion, which actually at my university library was about 4 books, but I was working up in the Midlands at the time. And so Wolverhampton Public Library became a very important source for me. So I think that was one part of it. And then why that stuck as a bug, which has never gone away and I've never been able to shake off, I don't know. Some of us just have this thing, I guess. And then the other one are just like the human relationships you make along the way, because they become extraordinarily important. And for me, that was meeting Parmjit Singh. And he clearly and evidently had the bug as well. And we just kind of fed off each other in our early 20s, and we traveled together, went to India together, went to Pakistan together, went round every auction house, and flea market, and Portobello Road was a Saturday morning haunt for us. Then we went into archives, and it's continued. It's continued for the better part of 30 years.
Wow, that's I love these conversations because I get to learn so much, and I also get to put people like yourselves kind of in a semi-hot seat and be like, well, all right, where did all of this begin? Like, where was the kind of the first step to be taken? And one thing that I find interesting then is I'm assuming you didn't do an arts degree at university then. Like, I'm assuming this is all kind of secondary to what your line of profession.
No, I'm a child of the 70s and 80s. No, arts degrees weren't really an option. I did an engineering degree, and actually, an engineering mind is not bad. It is not a bad place to start and look at not just our history, but the way that we've written our history. Because an engineer it looks for facts and data and information, and then builds up a model as a result of it. And I think it's not a bad place to start. I mean, I didn't have any of the kind of research disciplines that you need, and as now I work with like professional historians and researchers, you realise what a gap that is. But no, definitely did not have that kind of background, and so everything we did, particularly in the early days, was an add-on to work.
So one thing that I wanted to ask you, and to be honest, this is partly inspired by the it's entirely inspired by the webinar with Susan Strong that you guys held the other week. And again, thank you for shouting out the podcast. Definitely appreciated that. But one thing that always comes up is the Susan Strong Sicques Arts exhibition, 1999. It seems to have had a huge impact on the Sikh landscape, especially within the UK. Like, so for argument's sake, I'm sure you're more than well aware, when talking to Devinder Tood, kind of 1999 was the spark for him, so to speak, that led to kind of a lot of what happened after that. I just wanted to know, how did you end up getting involved in that? How did that then pan out? Because obviously you guys have done a whole load of exhibitions since then, the Golden Temple one probably being my favorite. But anyway, just putting that aside, how did you get involved with Susan Strong and all of that? And do you think that played a part then in your further development?
Yeah, definitely. You're absolutely right. That exhibition was the catalyst for so much activity that followed. And I always find it interesting just how many people's kind of origin story start with that exhibition in 1999 at the V&A. So Parmjit and I are like quarter generation older than Devinder. So Devinder was, I think he was like a 17-year-old during that exhibition, and he was showing people around, or at least showing them where to go. We were a little bit older, and we'd been kind of researching and gathering information. We were just hoovering up anything that we could find around London, as I said, in auction houses and markets and things. So these were objects, kind of interested in arms and armour, also paintings, or just anything, really. And then you quickly realise, when you do that, you rapidly realise that actually it's what you're looking at are the kind of scraps off the table, because the real gems lie inside archives. Because much of our material heritage, coincidentally, lies in London, right? It was brought over by the East India Company. It was brought over by company men of the East India Company or the Empire, and then came back into their possession, and then eventually worked its way into a national collection. So by the time that the Victoria and Albert Museum and Sue were starting to kind of start to really build up the research base, then ultimately making their selections, by the time that was kind of going on, I'm going to say 97, 98, something like that, probably 97. Parmjit and I were already working our way around the archive. So this is not the public archive. Sometimes it's the things that they hold in reserve. And one thing, if you've got credibility and you've got intent and you want to research something, then the national collections are actually very, very open places. They're very accessible. So we kind of knocked on the door at the V&A and said, can we come in and have a look at your stuff? And I still don't know to this day why Sue Strong entertained us for as long as she did. But we had a couple of meetings with her. We built up a really good rapport with her, and she just kind of threw open the doors to what was in the reserve collection for us. And we had a look around, and it ended up being a very valuable two-way relationship, because there were things that we could see and understand and interpret that the curatorial staff at the Victoria and Albert Museum, who have a very broad mandate, just couldn't see. So, I mean, the example I always give is they have a Dastar Bunga. It's on display. It's been on display for 20 years at the V&A. So this is a Nahanga Dastar. And the remarkable bit about it, of course, are all these beautifully damascened quoits, and there's a gudge guy in the middle and little weapons. It's on display, kind of sitting on a little pedestal, if I remember correctly, at the foot of at the throne in the Nehru Gallery. But in '99, it was in reserve, and it wasn't in any state to put out on display. But they made the decision that they were going to conserve this thing in order that they could put it out put it into the exhibition, and ultimately put it on display. So that's another one of those great legacies from the exhibition, is that new objects came out and on display for the very first time in 100 plus years. And while that was I think that was in textile conservation, so they were just working on the textiles, Parmjit and I went in and talked to the team and got a bit of an understanding about what's going on. And if you look very carefully at that, it's actually what the person has done, who obviously brought it over, is that they've made a kind of a wicker, a cane substructure. It's like a cone. It's almost like an upturned ice cream cone. So it's quite conical if you look at it on display at the moment. And then they just wrapped, quite simply, a bit of blue material over it, which is stitched. And then they place the quoits on top of that. And the textile conservators were kind of scratching their chins and saying, well, so we know this is a turban, but would there have been a chin strap? Would this thing have sat atop, this Nahang's head, and then he'd had a chin strap underneath? Because they just literally couldn't see how this thing works. And they assumed that it was a hat of some form. So, which of course, we instantly, and I'm sure as you were listening to that, you're thinking, goodness, that's such...
Yeah. I'm giggling, thinking, like, really? But then equally, I guess, like you're aware, there's that image in the Durham collections of Maharaj Ranjit Singh, and they've labelled it as Guru Tegh Bahadur Ranjit. So I think it just points to what you're saying, which is these guys have normally such a large collection or such a large mandate, and there's so much that they're having to contend with, that some of these kind of nuances, unless you're part of that lived experience or have an idea, like most people wouldn't, unless you knew how to tie the mullah, most people from the outside world would be like, how do you put that on your head? So no, I can appreciate that for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the partnership that unlocks all of that. And it's you have to have a generosity of spirit, right? From the museum to invite a couple of 20-year-olds or whatever we were in to advise them on that. And actually, just to close that one off, what Palm and I did, we told them obviously it wasn't like a motorcycle helmet. We happened to be going to Punjab like a couple of weeks later, and there's a little encampment of Nihangs just outside Chandigarh, and we filmed one of them tying his dastar in that manner, which is actually quite an old way of doing it. And nowadays, of course, they tie these bigger tamalle. But we had him tie it in that manner. We videoed it, and we played that back to the museum. And now suddenly there's that institutional understanding in the museum of how these things actually work. And so that was kind of it's just like a little insight into that exhibition, but how it worked for both of us. Because for us, that went on to do, I suppose, a couple of things. One was Susan Strong really encouraging us to take our research, which to that point was, just kind of scrappy folders full of stuff that we had come across, and publish it. And of course, when you get someone like that encouraging you to publish, you've got like a reference point, and suddenly it becomes more interesting for publishers, and that led to Warrior Saints. And then the other thing that happened coming out of that was the V&A had such a positive experience from that exhibition with, even now, the audience at the V&A, the kind of audience it gets, kind of upper middle class, white audience, frankly, the kind of artistic or design sensibilities. And what they were having in 99 were coach loads of Sicques, really, really engaged community that was coming to museums sometimes for the very first time. So they wanted to sustain that. So they gave us they gave us the opportunity really to try to sustain that audience. So what we did is, I think over 2 years, we did a series of evening talks, and it was called, what was it called? Anyway, the intent of it was every Monday night, I'm just making this up, like every Monday night, we would have another curator from the Victorian Albert Museum talking about an object or talking about something that they did. It's very much like the seminars I do on Zoom at the moment, except it was in real life. And it was brilliant. Frankly, I mean, we cut our teeth on how to organise things from that. So we did that for a couple of years with them. And then we did a big seminar called Preserving Sikh Heritage in 2001 in the Victorian Albert Museum's lecture theatre. We flew over. Gurmeet Rai, it's the first time I met Gurmeet. Who else was there? Susan talked, Dr. Deborah Swallows talked. But it was all about preserving Sikh heritage, manuscripts, material heritage, built heritage, touched on cultural heritage, and just brought together like a couple of hundred people that were interested in this topic. And of course, back in the early 2000s, the particularly in India, the preservation was comical. It was all about tearing it down and building it back up again, or famously whitewashing or putting bathroom tiles over things. So, for example, promoting the bathroom tiles at the Bunga Dal, I mean, that really embarrassed those. It's not. Yeah, I think it made a big difference in changing the attitude in India even about preservation of built heritage as well. And frankly, that's just one example of how the arts of Sikh kingdoms has just had this catalysing effect in the UK.
No, thank you for that. Because for me, I think Susan Strong's Arts of the Sikh Kingdom book was probably one of the first books that I kind of got hold of that just, again, blew open the door to kind of this, the word real history doesn't quite make sense. And I think it kind of takes away from the oral tradition that we're sometimes fed. But just for lack of better word, I just think that there's like a real tangible history that you can touch almost with that book, and that really did help push my interest further. But although this isn't the main topic of the conversation today, just one thing that I wanted to pick your brain on, especially considering the fact that you guys were able to engage with the institutions such as the V&A, and they were so positive in response. And actually you guys, for argument's sake, with the example of the Malla, were able to change kind of the institutional understanding of that. Now, it comes up time and again, and it's very topical at the moment, but this entire debate about museums holding these artifacts and them being repatriated and being returned or whatever. And I think you've also highlighted on the fact that India is not that great at preserving their heritage. I think William Dalrymple shared a mandir somewhere that was being demolished, and it had these frescoes, beautiful frescoes in there. But for someone in your position, and again, I'm more than aware that there's a nuance in that not everything's stolen, not everything was given for free, not everything is a present, like all the rest of it. But like, what do you think about this entire debate, and like, where do you see it? Where would you like to see it develop? Like, how would you like to see this positively move forward?
That's a really good way of framing that question, because it isn't a very positive. There isn't a very positive conclusion to it. So that's a good question. Let me have a ponder about that. But I note the conversation that you had with Davinder actually about stolen artifacts, and I think he gave a really, really nice example of that which is held up as being stolen heritage is anything but that. So I thought that was a really nice conversation. But I mean, fundamentally, if something was stolen, it should be given back, shouldn't it? I mean, I don't think I don't debate that. I think that's absolutely the right thing to do. And then of course you kind of agonize a little bit, because I do see how artifacts are conserved in this country, not just at the big national collections like the V&A, but even regional museums. And I think, oh, crikey, I wouldn't want them going back to India or Pakistan. I mean, that's not a reason not to return them, but it's it's a practicality, isn't it, Ahmed?
Yeah.
And just environmentally, let alone like the desire of Indians to want to preserve, but just environmentally, they're just in a better state. So it's a debate for those very reasons, right? That there's a moral case, and you can often make that moral case. And I fall on the side that if something was truly stolen, then it should go back. Why shouldn't it? But there's the practicalities of it. And then, of course, if you want to apply the standard of stolen, then, I mean, frankly, take the Koh-i-Noor, for example. I mean, books have been written about how that was acquired over the years, not least of which by the Sicques. And you could argue that was stolen, and where does it go back to? And all those arguments, I mean, they've been played out ad infinitum. But I like your framing of your question about what's the positive way forward to this. And I've never really got into that whole decolonize debate. I mean, I think it's right that we look at the language that we use, and the guardians of heritage, like the museums, etc., they look at the language that they use, and they do it in a manner that's cognizant of the history and the culture of where objects came from. It's absolutely right. If you take Sikh heritage in the UK, material heritage, I think it's fair to say, Ahmed, that the bulk of it lies in national collections in the UK. Right, or at least a large majority lies at the UK national collections, but it's very scattered. It's at the British Library, it's at the V&A, it's at the British Museum, it's in regional museums. It's kind of scattered everywhere. It doesn't have sufficient mass, if you like, critical mass, to warrant being on display in any one place. So you get these little bits here and there. Problem. It's also fair to say that the museums are not as tooled up to be able to tell Sikh stories as groups like us, for example. It's not just us, by the way, but there are some very mature, very sort of highly credible Sikh heritage groups now. What we lack is the space and resources that they get from national government. And I would quite like us to colonise them. I would quite like to get a corner of the British Museum or the Victorian Albert Museum, clear out 4,000 square feet, 5,000, 10,000 square feet, where they've got, 16th century Spanish floor tiles or whatever it is that they display that nobody, those galleries where people just kind of stroll through and they don't really pay attention. I would like to get one of those galleries, and I would like to actually put on a permanent exhibition, a permanent display there, and tell the Sikh story through our objects. So I think actually the decolonising debate would be great if that ended with a recolonising debate where actually the museums become, for some aspects of their heritage, actually become the guardians of the space as opposed to the guardians of what people get to see.
I like that. I really do like that response, because for me, even the framing of the answer, like recolonizing the museum space, I think that's just a brilliant way of kind of conceptualizing it. And I think, in all fairness, you've touched upon the kind of the nuance of this debate, which is there is a moral debate, which I don't think anyone has a question on. If it's stolen and needs to be returned. But I think there's a lot of practical issues in that. So again, like you alluded to the Devinder Tu conversation, just to reference that, he was like, well, let's say it was made by someone in Lahore and then was gifted to someone in Amritsar, and then that was like, where do you stop? So even with the Koh-i-Noor, at what point do you stop and say this is the true owner? And I think you're right, which is where we can, I guess that's fine and whatever. But if there's serious questions over its kind of preservation, then actually kind of recolonizing a space to provide our own history, our own kind of narrative, I think that's a really positive answer to a positively framed question. Because I think a lot of the time this debate just turns into the empire is terrible, we were victims at all times, and I just don't feel like we ever get anywhere with it. But I think that is at least gives something to go, you know what, we can work with that, or we can see kind of a positive outcome to it.
And there's a more immediate step as well. I mean, I always get frustrated at the museum's response saying, "Oh, we haven't got the space, because to display, right? Because 99% of objects that most museums own are in reserve, they're in archive. And honestly, this whole repatriation thing just goes away if they were to just display. But they can't, they don't have the space. But actually, they also don't do digital projects very well, in my opinion. They don't research the objects really well. I mean, you and I have every now and again, we see things on the internet which are just misdescribed and miscatalogued. And I think just being able to correct that and make it available very publicly just takes away a lot of the heat from the repatriation debate. Because there's nothing worse than saying, the Nationals have this heritage, but also they're keeping it secret or they're not doing anything with it. So I think actually there's a lot that they can do to try to take some of that heat away, but it takes investment.
Yeah, definitely. One question that got sent in by a member of the community, so to speak, was they wanted to ask, during kind of all of your research, has there been anything in particular that you've come across that's changed an assumption or changed a narrative that you've had previously?
So I think there's, that's a really good question. I like to think I don't have too many assumptions going into things. Palm always calls me a bit of a cynic or skeptical.
I think the example that I often like to use is Guru Gobind Singh Ji's wife adopted a child while she's in Delhi. And for me, when I first read that, I was quite surprised because and then the second thought I had was, if that story was more commonplace in a Punjabi Sikh household, I wonder if adoption would be as taboo as it is today. That was literally the connections I made. And I wonder, because I've obviously, like with family, friends or whatever, they've spoken about adoption. And what I've noticed is a lot of the time, the Punjabi Sikh community kind of are like, no, like they don't necessarily see it so positively. And I just thought that story would change, like automatically people's views would just change because they'd be like, well, hold on, like if Mataji did it, then like, what's the big deal?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I probably didn't make that. I didn't make that connection. I just find these things fascinating. I'm always fascinated by how little I actually know. That's one thing that I really love about the Monday night conversation that we have at the book club, is that you have somebody on and they just open your mind to something new and different. And I don't find that kind of, I find that like intellectually challenging, but I don't find it challenging kind of too many preconceptions. I think the work we did on the First World War, which was the exhibition called Empire, Faith, War, and that went on to do a project, on family histories around that. I think that really made me think very differently about our relationship to the British state, to how we kind of valorize war and valorize ourselves in that, but also just the practicalities of it. Just the practicalities of, why did these young men volunteer? And they all volunteered to go to war, because you do have, and particularly as a community, we do frame our war experience in a singular sort of way. And of course, the experience is much, much broader than that, which is one of the reasons why I'm not that keen on Sikh war memorials, because they tend to have just a singular image. It's usually like a young man, usually a combatant, in fact, almost always a combatant in a uniform, rifle on the shoulder, and he's sort of marching purposely forward. Or there's a funny one in Italy, isn't there, where he looks like a bodybuilder and he's kind of ripping his shirt off. So they're very masculine and they're very, very singular, whereas actually the Sikh experience of war was much broader than that. It was everything that is being displayed, but it is much broader. And 100 years later, I think we have we have the great benefit of being able to reflect and hindsight and look at the entirety of the war experience, which is the families that were left behind, the impact that it had on village societies, the flu epidemic, which was arguably exacerbated by men returning from war. Of course, Jallianwala Bagh, that happened afterwards. So there's this range of experiences in addition to, these notions of valor, in addition to, the great economic positive impacts that it had on people. So there is all of that, but then there are some others as well. And war memorials are pretty rubbish, in my opinion, particularly, to be really frank, Sikh-sponsored ones, at artistically trying to reflect that. And it frustrates me quite a lot that, a lot of community energy goes into things like memorials, and it doesn't go into memory. It doesn't actually go into the learning about what is it that took place, how did it impact us, how does it continue to impact upon us.
No, definitely. Now, one thing that it's just off the back of what you were talking about, and I'm just connecting dots here, which is, so I don't think anyone has a question that the Sikh experience of the war is obviously quite nuanced and multifaceted, because I think there's a tendency often to look at history in a monolithic fashion and be like, well, if this happened to that person, it happened to everybody like that. That's obviously not the case. But you mentioned Jallianwala Bagh and obviously the First World War being so close kind of just prior to it. Now, one thing that, and I've never had the opportunity to research this, but one thing that I've always wondered is World War II was only kind of like 20 odd years after that, and it would still have been in living memory, so to speak. And yet there was still a huge input from India during the Second World War. Obviously, you have the INA and that side of things, but just kind of ignoring that for a second. Like, and I know it's quite a deep question, but kind of just in a summary, like, how was the Raj able to galvanize a population that, from all intensive purposes, would have been absolutely devastated after Jallianwala Bagh?
Yeah, good question. So whenever you do anything on history, like, lesson number one is don't look at it through modern eyes. You've got to look at it through the eyes of people that were there at the time. And and the Second World War, you're absolutely right. 1.5 million men went to war in the First World War, 2.5 million went in the Second World War. So what on earth is going on there? But you've got to remember, you've got to see it through the eyes of the young volunteers. I don't know if anyone in your family went into the Second World War. People from mine definitely did. If you were a village boy, every single power structure is telling you that going to war is the right thing, or joining the army, is the right thing. There's just an undercurrent there is just, it gives you salary and a pension and status, a uniform, a chance to see the world. I always tell people the story of my grandfather and his brothers. So this is the First World War. That's how old I am. This is the First World War. My grandfather, my dad's side, 4 brothers, right? Brother one gets married. We're not from a very wealthy part of Punjab, right? So brother one gets married. The other 3 brothers, they know they are never going to get married, for all the reasons we know about land and stuff, that it would mean splitting the land, sort of meager plots of land that we had 4 ways, never going to happen. So brother one is married. Brother two sees a writing on the wall. Strapping young man, he goes, I'll join the army, right? So he joins the army, ultimately goes, serves in the First World War. Third brother, that's not much cop, doesn't fancy joining the army, evidently, and becomes a bit of a sort of village dropout, I think he becomes a camel trader, ultimately, just has kind of a bachelor life, if you like. And then brother 4, by the time he kind of comes of age, brother 1 has died, and brother 4 marries the wife of brother 1. Again, not uncommon, keeping it all kind of in the family. But it's just a very common experience. And when you start researching the First and Second World War, they actually, in the recruitment registers, they make note of where someone has volunteered and they are the only son of a family. They may know, because that's quite a remarkable kind of fact. So socially, economically, it's kind of valuable to join the army. The army doesn't take anyone. It sets quite a high bar. It recruits very heavily from the Punjab. And so it's a position of, immense status. Men that come back are often, they got a pension, they get status. But remember that, as I said right at the beginning, every single power structure in Punjab and in India is telling you that this is the right thing to do. Your local, your sarpanch and lambadar and village panchayat and all the rest of it, they are economically incentivized to get young men to volunteer. At the district level, all of the kind of district commissioners and God knows what else, anything that people look up to in their locale, whether they're British or salaried Indians, are telling you, sign up. This is the right thing to do. Local, often they get called collaborators now, but it's like the Maharajas and the nobility and the people of status. They are recruiting. We had a great big section on the Maharaja of Patiala. In fact, all of the Maharajas and their recruitment, particularly during the First World War. Same thing happened in the Second. It's what they are telling you to go to, all the way up to Delhi and the Lieutenant General of this, that, and the other are telling you to go to war. Even the only political voice, or the mainstream political voice, should I say, for an Indian to look to, people like the Indian National Congress, even they are telling you to go to war. In the First World War, Mahatma Gandhi was an ambulance driver and was encouraging people to volunteer, if not as a combatant, then certainly as something like an ambulance man. In the Second World War, they were recruiting. So you have to be a really remarkable, politically sophisticated, incredibly politically sophisticated person with phenomenal political foresight, because you don't know any of these power structures are going to crumble in 10 or 30 years. You don't know that. You just think that's the norm. That's the norm that's around you as you grow up. And you have to be very politically sophisticated. You have to have political prescience, the likes of which almost nobody else has, to say this is the wrong thing to do. So, of course, you do it. And remember that both in the First and the Second World War, so let's take the First World War, because we're talking about, why did they get recruited the Second? And people don't know this, because often the First World War is talked about in terms of loss of life. But for every 100 Indians that went to war, 92 of them came back, right? So the death rate was not that high. It's high, but it's not that high. So for most people, they would have seen these First World War veterans come back. They were salaried. They'd seen the world. God knows what they did while they were out there. I'm sure they had a lot of fun. But they were pensioned. They had uniforms. They would. My mum tells me that in her village there was a World War I veteran, and he was a little bit older, obviously, when she was a little girl, but that he would take a walk around the village every night, and he wore these beautiful white kurta pajama. He had a cane, and he walked with his wife around the village, did a little sahar around the village. And she thought that was like the absolute height of sophistication and kind of urban, progressive thinking, that he walked with his wife around the village. But that's what these people grew up seeing, and they kind of went, "Yeah, I want a part of that." So is it any wonder that they joined? The question you should be asking is, what about those absolutely remarkable people that went, to hell with this? We're going to oppose it, because they're the really remarkable ones. The ones that kind of, particularly the ones that went to Canada and the west coast of the United States, and they thought, no, actually, I'm going to give up this life of economic success, and rather than building a life here, I'm actually going to oppose what's going on in India, and to do that in a particularly violent way. So actually, them recruiting in large numbers in the Second World War actually doesn't surprise me in the slightest. What surprises me are the people that actually opposed it.
One thing that I think I find quite interesting, just recently, I got hold of Roman Hayes' book about the INA in Germany and its relationship with the Nazis and the Axis powers. And I think one thing that I find quite interesting is, and you've actually alluded to it in relation to Sikh history, is kind of this black and white version of kind of the 20th century, with it being the British are always, or the kind of the Allied forces are always right and the Axis forces are always wrong, and basically Germany is always incorrect. Now, I'm not, before anyone misquotes me and tries to misinterpret this, I'm not defending Nazism. I think that's obviously just unequivocally not going to happen. However, what I'm trying to point out is that during the Second World War, the INA, up until the point Hitler walks into Russia, is pretty much very open to getting Nazi help to try to destabilize the British Raj. And whenever posts are made about this, everyone is just automatically like, oh, how dare they work with Hitler? How dare they do this? How blah, blah, blah. And I think you've hit it on the head, which is like, we view it from a modern lens, and we're viewing it from what, like 70 years of hindsight. We know things about Hitler and the final solution and everything else that happened that people at that time just wouldn't even had a clue about, let alone Indians turning up in Germany during the height of the Second World War. And I think another thing that I find quite interesting, and again, it nuances the tale even further, is that Bose was after Hitler to actually edit his Mein Kampf to remove the parts where he basically ridicules Indians. Now, I just find that quite interesting on a separate note, that during the height of this global warfare, the INA are more concerned about what Hitler has to say in his book than actually anything else. But yeah, there's always this kind of reaction to it as though it's intrinsically good or intrinsically bad. And I think, just as you've pointed out, there are various and almost kind of this huge cultural force that is kind of pushing you in a certain direction. And you're right, you'd have to have the political foresight or the kind of the knowing of what's about to happen. I think that most people just wouldn't, or just no one would, to be fair. But yeah, I just think it's incredible how kind of nuanced and interesting it gets, especially with how black and white that kind of history, especially in the UK, is taught. So I was obviously taught the Second World War during GCSE and A-level, and you always hear about the kind of the Allied version of events, but it's really interesting to see the Indian version of events, I guess, for want of better words, which is basically Hitler had agreed, when I say agreed, he had essentially written down that he was looking to invade India at one point if invading Russia had gone well. And I just think things like that just change the narrative automatically, because you're like, what? I always just thought Hitler was bothered about Europe, or whatever the case might be. I know we've gone off on a tangent, but it's just to try and point out that it's not ever as black and white, I think, as a lot of people make it out to be. And hindsight is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I agree with everything that you've just said. I think the other point is, you said, in the UK, when you were taught about history, you didn't learn about the Indian side, etc. I always find it interesting with India, like modern India, what they are taught in history, because the whole of their history kind of syllabus at school age, not so much afterwards, but at school age, is done through the lens of independence of some form or the other. So there's little on Mughal, the Mughals, but there's much more on the opposition to the Mughals, as ineffective as it was until it kind of imploded. Or it's about, this is why we have this debate about the 1857 uprising versus mutiny. And the mutiny or uprising is framed in terms of, the First War of Independence. The Second World War is framed in terms of the INA. And these are less. And so with Indians, they have this very jaundiced view, I think, of history. I suppose we all do. We all carry some biases, don't we? But I think the way that it's taught there is just, it's different and damaging in its own way.
So one question that I just want to ask in relation to all of this before we move the conversation on is, how instrumental do you think the British martial race theory was in ensuring Punjabis volunteered in the numbers they did? Or am I again trying to connect perhaps something that's slightly too distant from the reality? Because I think looking back with hindsight, it's quite easy to read things and be like, oh, you can see how they're kind of demarcating Sikhs, or however they're kind of defining us. But again, I guess you alluded to how the British Army had a kind of a standard which you had to pass. So again, even just that would have kept some people out. But again, just coming back to the martial race theory, like, how influential do you think that was?
No, I think it did have a massive bearing on it. And so that it did have a massive bearing on the fact that, or the reason why there are so many Sikhs in the Indian Army at the beginning of the First and Second World War, because the Brits took it really seriously. So they only recruited from those particular classes, those Sikhs, Rajputs, Punjabi Muslims, Gurkhas, etc., etc. And of course, that goes back to the uprising in 1857. In 1857, the army recruited basically from one class, which is upper class or high class Hindus. So there's a sense of kinship that runs through the 100,000, 200,000 men, which is a really dangerous place to be. If you're ruling India and you are outnumbered 2,000 to 1, white men to Indians, and the ratio is something like that. I think it is in the 1850s. It's really dangerous that your sword arm is being held by 100,000 men, all of whom have exactly the same religious sensibilities. It is much more valuable. It's really strategically important that they don't have a sense of kinship with each other. So the martial races theory both does this slightly nonsense thing where it says some people are manly and masculine and well suited for recruitment, like Sikhs, like Punjabi Muslims. But what it's also doing is it's fracturing Indian society in a way that's making sure that, and this is very clever, of course, this takes deep understanding of how the different religions and different types of people interact, so that they could never gang up. There is no universe within which a Sikh and a Balochi Muslim will kind of partner up on a religious debate. It just isn't going to happen. So the thing that led to 1857, which was this rumor, may have been true, that cartridges were greased with pork or beef fat or whatever it was, that's just not going to ripple through. That type of thing is just not going to ripple through an army which is fractured by down religious lines. What's also interesting, and we may go back to war stuff at some point, is their very deep understanding of caste and the use of it in the army as a motivational tool, if you like, but also, or a tool of morale, but also as a tool of also something to be very, very wary about, because you couldn't have, for example, a quote unquote low caste person in a commanding role over quote unquote higher caste people, and they're super conscious of that, and they know precisely how to engineer things to avoid those sorts of things happening.
No, thank you. So a lot of people, and currently I've had a conversation and a debate with a few people about this, but it often comes up that there's this narrative that the martial race theory was quite instrumental in almost reconstructing the Sikh martial identity in a way that had taken its source of sovereignty coming from the Guru to being from a nation state figurehead. So in this case, it's the Queen or the King or whatever. I think it's a very complex topic in a debate, and there's obviously lots of nuance to this, but the kind of an argument that's put forward is that this martial race theory has almost been internalized to a point now where Sikhs are almost unable to distinguish between their own sovereignty and martialness granted via the Guru and a sovereignty provided by a temporal authority, in this case the nation state, the head of the nation state. Now, for someone who has researched and worked in the area that you have, and obviously World War One is kind of the main topic that we want to stick to today, is like, what are your thoughts on that, and how do you, like, what are your perceptions of that, really?
I don't think there's too much debate that in the large part, Sikhs have kind of internalised their role in, national armies as being a manifestation of the kind of martial tradition that we have, which starts from the time of the Gurus. I think that's evident, right? We see it in the kind of, again, this valorizing of men in uniform, and clearly the British had a lot to do with that. There's a really interesting quote from, I think it's McMahon, who writes a book called Armies of India, and he says, without the British Army, or without the Indian Army, Sikh traditions would not have survived. Words to that effect. I think he says Khalsa traditions would not have survived, because, of course, to be in the Indian Army, you couldn't just be like a regular Sikh. You had to be a Sikh who was baptized or initiated. The identity, the participation in nations' armies, particularly the Indian Army, and that's been kind of merged, if you like, with the sort of notions of martial spirit. Not entirely, but in the main, I think that's true. Is that right or wrong? That's what I think where the debate tends to go. I tend to not get too involved in the whole judgment call that goes with it. But I don't think it's eclipsed it, right? I still think at the same time, even at a very sort of facile, sort of simplistic level, things like, Hulla Mahalla, which is, it's a little bit of a kind of tamasha, isn't it, sometimes? But even that, that is still a demonstration of Sikh martial traditions. I think the sad thing isn't that it's been co-opted by armies. I don't think that really is I don't think that's a major issue, actually. I think the sad thing is just that we, should I say the opportunity is, we should learn more about what that martial tradition is. And I think and you've been previewing a few little things from Nidar Singh, for example, which I found quite interesting, because I think that's the route that goes down. You realise just how, we realise just how disconnected we've become from it. Your conversation with Kamarup I found really fascinating as well, because the Dasam Granth is almost in parts anyway, is so much about articulating the martial traditions of the Sikhs as the Guru saw it. And yet we're so disconnected to it, so much so that we've almost discarded that. I think that's the issue, less so about whether men in uniform are being seen as or being touted as the Sikh military traditions. I don't really see that. Now, interesting, from a historical perspective, what we did in our republishing of Warrior Saints. So when we redid that in 2 volumes, second volume TBA, is that the first volume, which takes you from the times of the Gurus right the way up to the end of Sikh sovereignty in the Punjab, so right up to the Second Anglo-Sikh War in 1849. That book is jacketed with this wonderful portrait of a Nihang who kind of typifies the native, if you like, Sikh military tradition. And then the second volume, when it comes out, will have a portrait, that lovely portrait that we used on the 1999 edition of the retired Army Subadar Nihal Singh, who's wearing this kind of, army get-up and this tartan turban. And that takes you from the period 1849 onward, which is dominated by the Sikhs' role in the Indian Army and various other military endeavours. Although running right the way through that is this constant thread of people like the Nihangs who keep alive that tradition right the way back from the time of the Gurus.
Just on a quick side note, the 1999 version of the Warrior Saints book that you guys published, I remember I was really young at this time, probably like 10 or 12. My mum had bought a copy of it, and we had gone to our Gatka class that day, and I don't know why, but mum had left it at the back of the room, and by the end of the class it had disappeared. So we never got that copy back. But the other month, I think maybe a few months ago, I saw a copy of it come up for auction on an online website, and it was going for like 50 quid. So I thought, fine, perfect, put my bid in. The auction went live. It eventually sold for 300 quid, and I was just sat there going, oh God, like that's insane. But equally, it goes to demonstrate how valuable that book is, and the stuff that you put out. But just a couple of things then on this conversation. I think you're correct in highlighting that we are very distanced from the Dastam Gun, for argument's sake, or from certain traditions like Shastra Vidya. I would probably argue that the process of that happening, and again, a lot of this understanding actually comes from the work that you guys have done, or the exhibitions that you guys have put on, which is like, so for argument's sake, making arms, the Arms Act, which made it illegal for not just Nahangs, but Nahangs included, to be carrying Shastra, and everything that goes along with that is almost parallel to this, for want of a better word, colonization through the army, for argument's sake. So for me, I would almost be like, well, they're like two sides of the same coin. I think you're correct in that the Nahangs and certain Sampradas, or school of the old thought, have continued this on. But I guess just to add some historical nuance to this, some of Guru Gobind Singh Ji's Sikhs fought in Bahadur Shah's army. According to pretty much all pre-colonial texts, Guru Gobind Singh Ji actually fought in a battle alongside Bahadur Shah, which for me is pretty insane. On top of that, Jassa Singh Ramgarhia was employed by the imperial forces whilst he was alive, and again he got loads of his colleagues and Sangat essentially jobs in the army because he knew it paid well. And actually, I think he was able to pretty much use the system he was part of to get a siege removed. I can't remember exactly the details, but again, being part of the system isn't necessarily always a bad thing. However, the kind of the modern debate that gets thrown up is the location of which your sovereignty comes from. And I guess that in itself is a debate which we could be here all day with.
There's a notion of sovereign versus separate.
Yeah, it's all
right.
Yeah.
Sovereign just means you're in control of yourself, right?
Yeah. But then I guess how far do you take that? Because for argument's sake, even if you say, okay, well, being part of the army, you're not sovereign because you're fighting someone else's war. And again, we don't need to necessarily highlight some of the atrocities these armies have been part of. But then, like, even, all right, let's say you don't take part in the army, but then you're still not sovereign. Like, you're still part of that system. You can't, like, how far can you take yourself out of that? So I think equally the debate is needed, but then the practicality of that is something that I'm like, well, how are you able to ever influence and change anything if you're not kind of going to either work from within, so to speak?
Possibly. I was struck. I think two things just struck me when you were talking. One is that you said the atrocities that those modern armies have committed. Have you studied any of Bant Prakash?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's gruesome. Right? It's gruesome, but then it's real, right? These are what these men had to do in battle. It's and I'm not, by no means a scholar of it, but there's a very there's a very polished, sanitized version of Sikh history where men in Kesari Kamar Kase kind of stride forward and strike down the Mughals, and it's all over very quickly and almost bloodlessly. But the reality is that 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th century battle is pretty gruesome stuff. And the other thing that struck me was Javala Singh's brilliant Suraj Prakash exposition on his podcast, which I think is just called Suraj, isn't it? The Suraj podcast. I think it's extraordinary for all kinds of reasons, one of which is this kind of the intertwining between the Sikh gurus and the Mughal state. And I mean, there are times in it where I literally don't understand why. That is the one that really kind of undermines my understanding of how the politics played out between the Sikh court and the court of the Mughal emperor. But I just think it's extraordinary. I think it's much more complicated than the debate is often framed, right? Which is, good and bad. Sovereign often in that debate often means, as I said, separate. And I don't think sovereign means separate at all.
No, I think I wouldn't disagree. And again, this is also why I enjoy asking these type of questions to the people like yourself that we get on this podcast, because we all know it's not black and white, but to kind of explore the nuance and kind of see what people in your position with kind of your research and everything else that goes with it really does help, I think, inform the conversation or the arguments that then will continue, basically, because I think a lot of the time people are putting forward and chiming in and it's coming from the best of places, but it's not necessarily as well informed as I think it can be. So again, I can only appreciate you answering that as well. So no, thank you. Just something then that someone had asked, and again we've kind of just gone off on a bit of a tangent, but just coming back to this then is when you first started out with your research, and again you said it was kind of university that after reading Khushwant Singh's 2-volume Sikh history of the Sikhs, you kind of got the bug. Did you ever expect to take it to where you guys have publishing these books, putting on these exhibitions, inspiring people like myself and everything that goes with it? Did you ever, when you're at university, be like, I want to take it to this level or whatever? Did you ever expect to get here?
There's a really short answer to that, isn't there? Which is no. No, absolutely not. I think, when you write and publish your first book, as you've probably found, you think you've hit the peak, and that's it, you're done, kind of thing, and then you just keep going on the journey. And here, I think the biggest driver, the biggest kind of inspiration for that, the motivator for all of that is my relationship with Parmjit Singh, because he, I think he is just extraordinary. He's a researcher the likes of which I've never come across. It connects evidence and clippings and pictures in a way that constantly blows my mind. But he has something else as well. I think this is where he's probably a generation ahead of himself, or maybe 2 generations ahead of himself. He pushes the boundaries of what we do and how we do it as well. So transitioning from writing a book to then doing that Golden Temple exhibition, that's him. That's Parm completely. In fact, I think if you turn the clock back to the conversation where he told me that, I would have been saying, no, that sounds like a stupid idea. But Parm has this kind of vision, he can see things that often we can't. And then constantly kicking the quality standard upward, never accepting what we do as being of good enough quality, always just pushing it a bit further, even if that means kicking out a deadline, even if that means delaying something for a bit longer, but always pushing that up. And I think the mark of that is not just our work, actually, which I'm really proud of, and I think has had a great impact. And when I say our, I mean the team that does this, because often people at Parm and I get a lot of credit for the work of a lot of other people. But it's also had a galvanizing effect inside the Sikh world as well. I mean, I just think the fact that there are so many new books coming out now that they just were not in existence back in the 90s is to do with Kashi House and what Parm's built there. The fact that the Sikh, if you wind back the clock to the 90s, if there was anything done on Sikh history, it would be done inside the context of a Gurdwara. It's not a bad thing, but it's very internal to the Sikh community. And it was done within our own resources, stuff that was within the community kind of brought together and being displayed. There was a guy from Coventry called Janan Singh Jan who would go Gurdwara to Gurdwara, and he had this sort of exhibition. And the fact now that it is so much more about engaging with collections, it's so much more, the Leicester Museum will have something that kind of goes up. I think that's a lot of that is to do with Parmjit and what he's done with Akbar and Kashi House, with the public exhibitions, with obviously the publishing program. And as well. I mean, he's an extraordinary individual. I would love for you to do a podcast with him, but he's always really he likes his work to do the speaking for him. So good luck with that one.
Well, I was actually going to ask you at the end of the podcast if I could get his contact details, and I'm going to try and bug him really, because Devinder Toor has again obviously alluded to how instrumental, because they're cousins, and how instrumental Parmjit is, and then obviously yourself. One question that got sent in relation to the Warrior Saints book, and I'm kind of glad that you touched upon the images. Why did you pick that image? Because basically the person who sent in the question goes, when I first saw this book, the image basically just jumped out and slapped me in the face. He goes, it was absolutely just mind-blowing to see this. And so he wanted to know, what, considering obviously you had such a wide range of images you could have picked from, why that one in particular, and why such a kind of close, zoomed in image of it?
Now, this is how you can get Parmjit on your podcast, Ahmed. Ask him about that jacket image, because you've got an hour of conversation there, which will be fascinating and riveting. So I'll try not to give too much of that away, but I think if you just ask him just about that image, I think there's a real story there. Why that? Well, so first of all, just the idea of having a 2-volume work, which the first volume is from the period of the Gurus to the end of Sikh Raj in the Punjab in 1849, and exemplifying that, exemplifying the Sikh martial tradition in that period, has to be a Sikh from the kind of very archetype of the Sikh martial, sort of manifesting the Sikh martial tradition. So, a great picture of a Nahang just makes absolute total sense. And then the second volume, as I said, is more of that kind of formalized, he's a retired super dive major from the Indian Army, but it's also artistically a very beautiful picture. But that first jacket image, which, it is striking, and the eyes draw you in. And so it is just an arresting photograph, which is it was buried as a double-page spread, I think, in the 1999 edition, but when you got to it, it always made you pause. And it's part of a series, I think, of photographs of people from the Deccan region, Hyderabad. And there are a couple of Nihangs that were photographed by the same photographer. There's another one, which is an older Nihang, and I think in the 99 one, we put them across 2 pages. But it is both striking, it exemplifies that tradition, and you can absolutely pick it apart. In fact, I think in the caption, been a long time since I looked at it, Parmjit's probably done most of the work there on just pulling apart all of the different weaponry that he has on his person, which is, again, really interesting. But just that the image is just such a striking one. We've always absolutely loved it. Parm will tell you that's like part of his origin story in terms of how he got there. But I'll tell you another little interesting follow-up story to that, which is that we just knew this as I think it was captioned Sikh Hyderabad, and it was, we knew the photographer's names. That's often the case with Indian photographs. You know more about the white dude that took the picture than the person in it. But I think it's a Hooper photograph, if I remember correctly. And then about, I think it was the year 2000, I was in New York for a wedding, and I took like a couple of hours off while my wife was shopping, and I said, I just need to go do something. And I went to the collection of the Al-Qazi collection, so in New York. So Ibrahim Al-Qazi was a collector of 19th century Indian photographs. And he had his collection there in New York City, in Manhattan, and we had built a bit of a relationship up with him in London. So I went into the collection and said, pull me out all of the Sikh stuff that you have. And of course it wasn't catalogued, so you just had to go through boxes and boxes. But I had like this 1 hour to do it in. And in looking through that, this photograph pops up, which I was in just a random box called, I think, the Deccan. And it is a picture of 4 or 5 figures 4 or 5 Nihang figures, posed very stylistically as you would in a painting, but obviously a photograph is taken of them. And one of them is our man, Mad Eyes, as Parmjit calls him, from the jacket of the book, and he's standing there in profile, full length. And that photograph is the one that's gone onto the jacket of In the Master's Presence. So we build up, every time if you see enough of these things, I think Davinder was saying the same thing, once you've seen a million pictures, then you're able to make those connections, and you're able to kind of see what's what.
No, definitely. Now, what goes into producing one of these books then? Because obviously, like in the introduction, we alluded to, well, I picked on 2 that I think have been really instrumental: Warrior Saints and the Golden Temple book. In the Master's Presence, again, is an amazing book, and I'm not going to say too much about that, because obviously I spoke to Nadal about it, and it was really, really interesting to get his input on that. But yeah, what goes into producing these books? Like, how many hours of not hours, months of research goes into them? Like, what is the kind of the process? And again, you guys have got Warrior Saints Volume 2 coming out soon. And I'm also wanting to question Parmjit about Master's Presence Volume 2, because I asked Nadad, and again, he said you need to ask Parmjit. So I feel like he's the man with all the information. But no, just from your perspective, what goes into producing these books, and what is it like doing that?
So let's take none of them are typical. Everyone's got its own story, right? But if you take the Golden Temple of Amritsar, this big anthology of every image that we could find between, I think, the earliest ones from the 1800s all the way up to 1960, I think 1959, I think was it cut off at. That was in a sense, the research for that was done over 20 years, because if you are looking for visual heritage of the Sikhs, you come across the Harmandir Sahib and Amritsar all the time. To such an extent, you get a little bit dull to it. You go, another photograph, another painting, another cloth label or whatever, which has got the Harmandir Sahib depicted on it. And the discipline of logging them away and archiving them, and making sure you can kind of understand key bits of information, that was kind of done over 20 years. By the time we came to that idea of the exhibition, it just seemed really obvious. I think Parmjit had a big part to play on that, to say, well, why don't we write the authoritative, I'm not trying to sound arrogant here, but the kind of canonical book showing every image that we can of the Harmandir Sahib, every and Amritsar and its surroundings, try to tell the story of that place in the way that we would, and also accompany it with all of the observations that people have made as travellers, as pilgrims, as colonial administrators, whatever, through the history of it being in existence. So massive undertaking, and by no means the work of 2 people. Look really carefully at the acknowledgements in that book, because you will see a team in there, some of whom you probably know, some of whom that you probably see in our exhibitions. And if I start naming them, I know I'll miss some out. But that team, that Akfa Kashi House team, really do a lot of the heavy lifting, because they're converting what is an archive of images and quotes into actually putting it into a book with the discipline of knowing where you've sourced every image from, that you've got high-risk quality image, all that boring practical stuff. All of that heavy lifting is done by this very dedicated volunteer team, brilliant, absolutely brilliant in their own rights, that really kind of do most of the heavy lifting for that. And then people like Palm and I get to put our names at the front of it. We kind of split the work 2 ways. I tend to do the writing. He tends to do the image research and a lot of the captioning and the kind of pulling it together, so curating it, if you like. And then I'll do more of the kind of that introductory essay or some of the captions or whatever. But no, just it's a massive group undertaking. The Warrior Saints reprint exactly the same. What else we did? Jallianwala Bagh was a little bit more of Parmjit and I. Again, I did the writing, he did much of the picture research. But Kim Wagner is the third hidden hand in that book because, of course, he wrote the authoritative history on the massacre in 1919. So each one is different, but each one is more than the work of the two of us.
Roughly then from, say, you were to start the project today, how long does it normally take to print then?
The practicalities of getting something.
Let's say we were talking today and we were like, oh, let's do Warrior Saints Volume 3. Like, roughly how long would that take to be produced as a book?
So the longest bit is the research, right? And if, in a sense, we're always researching. So I had this kind of like secret plan to write the authoritative biography of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And in a sense, I'm researching it now. I kind of don't know I'm doing it, but you'll pick up little bits of information. I was looking through Umdat Tawariq earlier this month and saw a few things and quickly, scanned them and logged them away because I think they'd be interesting on it. So in many respects, the research is the long bit, but if you've been at the game for a long time, it's kind of there in the background, building up. And then actually the compiling of it is, it's a, like the Jallianwala Bagh book came together quite quickly, having done the work on it, but Kim did a lot of the heavy lifting on helping us structure that the other books can take a year or so. And getting them into print is actually can take even longer because frankly, it's just about, whether you've got the means to be able to, particularly for Kashi House, you've got the means to be able to publish them. If the Kashi House books were flying off the shelf so quickly that the cash was being recovered, you could then plow it into the next project. You'd see a whole lot more coming out of publishing houses, not just us, but other publishing houses as well. Unfortunately, the Sikh community isn't very good at buying books, frankly, and so it's a tough. So we had this funny experience after we did Warrior Saints, which we thought was a real success. This is back in '99. We went back to our publisher, IB Tourist, and we said, hey, how about another one? We'll do something, how about a next book? And we must have had a list of things that we wanted to do. And they kind of went, we dipped our toe into the Sikh market. It's not really there. There isn't really a good Sikh book buying market. We think the Sikh market for new Western-produced books is worth about £10,000 a year. And that's just not sustainable. That's not good enough. This is back in 99, right? 2000. And if you go back then, there were only like, 2, 3, 4 mainstream Sikh books being published a year. Obviously, 99, there was this big splurge of stuff. But generally speaking, there wasn't that much going on. And Sikhs are just not particularly avid buyers. In fact, Warrior Saints, a lot of them got bought by military historians, right? Western military historians. And it was I felt really dejected. And it's like, of course you can't run a business on £10,000 sales a year. And by coincidence, I bumped into a friend of mine who I'd worked with work in the Midlands, and a white guy. And he had turned his hand to car number plates, personalised number plates. And he said that is worth, this is back in 99, he goes, the Sikh number plate business is worth £100,000 to £200,000 a year. It's worth 10 times that. Because anyone trading number plates knows all of the Sikh surnames, the Gills, the Gadewals, the Sindhus. They know them all because they know once they've got one, it's like gold dust, right? If they can kind of, finagle the numbers and letters to try to look like a Sikh surname, they know they're in business. And I thought that told you everything you need to know about the world that we're operating.
Yeah. Do you think that it's a similar situation still today, or do you think there's like a change in the attitudes? Because I think, for argument's sake, do you think the generations that have come kind of after you guys have perhaps taken more of an interest? Because I think we're perhaps more detached from that experience.
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, the generations change as well, don't they? And people are more professional and they got a bit more money in their pocket and they kind of want to do it, but it's not an easy sell. We should have, as a community in this country, we should have a very active cultural industry of all kinds of cultural output, whether that's exhibitions or books, film, novels, whatever. We should be leaning on the door of the Netflixes of this world, which is much more popular culture, of course. You do that from a basis of having great books. And this is Parmjit's argument. This is why he's created this thing called Kashi House. All great cultural output, particularly popular culture, comes from great research and great books. It all does. But that we can't seem to get like a real output, that we don't have. We have 400,000 Sicques in this country. If 1 out of every 100 of those, that's all it takes, 1 out of every 100 buys a book when it comes out, whether it's from Kashi House or one of the mainstream publishers, you would have a thriving industry, but we are not anywhere near that. People like you, and probably the people that listen to this podcast, are frankly weirdos.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
We are the 0.1, but we're the 0.1%. Frankly, as a community, we haven't quite matured enough yet. There's still, if you had a podcast on personalised plates, I bet you'd do a lot better than you would, or Sicques and football or something. I bet you'd do a lot more in numbers than you're doing at the moment. We haven't quite matured to that level. The race, though, is between us as a community kind of maturing into those cultural pursuits. Actually, I'm not talking high culture here, I'm talking interpretive dance or anything like that. I'm just saying books and levels of interest. Because the generation below me it's got all kinds of other things it's interested in. And it's much less connected to its Sikh origins. Like my kids, I have to work a little bit harder at than I did. They have fewer of the language skills. They don't go to India quite so often as we used to. Those sorts of things.
Yeah, I often have this discussion with my dad actually, and I'm like, because I've got 2 little nieces, and I often have a conversation with my dad, and I'm like, I find it really interesting because Dad was born in Kenya and then came over in the 70s with my grandma, and then we're all born here. And I was like, it's going to be interesting when this. I was like to my father, I was like, when your generation's gone, because you guys are almost the last bridge between a different view, perspective, understanding of things, and then being British, quote unquote. And I was like, even my grandma's generation, like there's very few of them around. And I think for me, they are like the last connection between, and again, I don't mean to romanticize it, but like that old understanding and everything that comes with that. And I think, and to be honest, a lot of the debate that I have with my dad about like, how do we kind of continue to ensure we can pass on the learnings and the teachings that we've gained from my grandma or my father or whoever. And partly that's kind of why I started doing the podcast, because I was like, how can I further my understanding to ensure that I can then kind of further someone else's, in this case my nieces, further their understanding and help them figure out what's going on in this crazy world. But it's just crazy, really, how you've mentioned that the Sikh community are far more interested about number plates than they are about their history, and I think that just says everything we need to know. And you're right. I've had conversations with my own brothers about buying number plates. To be honest, we're probably slightly atypical in that we're not that bothered about our second names, but private number plates are certainly something that even in my own family, Dad's got a private plate. My uncle's got a private plate. My auntie's got a private plate. Yeah. So yeah, you're definitely on the board.
I also know your family has books as well, so you're off the hook.
Yeah. No, that's a fair balance.
So that's a really interesting point you made. I did a podcast with Sushma Jansari at the British Museum a few weeks ago, and we were talking about memory and this idea of sort of losing the memory of generations and things. And we kind of happened across this. We almost like developed a project in that podcast, and that was something that we called press record, which is this idea that we are having those really interesting intergenerational conversations, but we don't record them. So everyone's got a phone on them. Just press record when you have that conversation with your grandmother, or for me it'd be my mum, which isn't about, let's go to Costco tomorrow, but it's the conversation that's about the family history, life in the bin, the reminiscence type conversation. And we thought if we could kind of give some structure to that, because the technology already exists in everyone's hands, but some structure around what are some good questions to ask, how do you make sure that you get the best answer out of there, what are some of the guidelines, and we do that very targeted to South Asians in this country. I think you pick up some phenomenally valuable archival material for the future, right? So this is the generation that maybe didn't live through partition, but certainly lived through the bit after it, certainly have memories of what partition did to the Punjab. And then, of course, their story of coming to this country and settling in and setting up and everything, and that will all be gone. It's rapidly going. So I think that would be that's a really interesting project. I'm quite keen on just pushing Sushma to see if we can do something on that.
No, it sounds brilliant, and I think it's a very modern and practical way of just ensuring we, to some extent, can preserve that memory and that understanding. I know for one, I think we requested my grandma to record her, when she does her nitnem, just record the entire thing. And so just little things like that. Like, I think it's just a brilliant way of keeping a connection to that.
I think that's brilliant. And I think just being able to spread that out as a practice, I think that would really benefit. The other thing I think, this is my very optimistic view, is that I think once in everyone's life, even the most sort of disconnected Sikh, right? I think once in their life they have a moment. It's usually when they have kids or when they go to university. It's like these life-changing moments, right? That they want to reconnect. They want to understand their heritage. They go, why am I here? Why am I here not pushing a plough in Punjab, or why am I here? And I want my kids at least to have some appreciation. And it's there's like a little voyage of interest that goes on. And if people like us can feed that with good content, whether it's online or in books or whatever, I think you can kind of you can feed it, and perhaps you can even nurture it, and you can turn it into something that's more than just like a fleeting interest. And I think that what the really positive thing is that there's just a lot of material around at the moment, things like your podcast, things starting to appear on YouTube in a professional manner. But I think they have to be done. Remember what you're doing when you're trying to get to people's eyeballs or into their ears is that you are competing with everything else that's trying to get on in front of them or get into their ears. So you've got to do this at the standard of the Netflixes and the BBCs of this world. That's really challenging without resources.
No, definitely. Another question that someone sent in was in relation to the books, and I found it quite interesting because I think for someone who's had experience doing a history degree, one thing with narratives and historical viewpoints is that they're constantly developing. And for me, I think I'm quite honest in that I'm more than happy to change my conclusion on some evidence. And I have to admit that the books that you guys have produced, I don't necessarily think put forward a particular narrative, but putting that aside, the question was essentially, how do you ensure you balance the evidence you guys have in the books you produce and the narrative with kind of developing theories that may I guess what he's trying to get to is that at some point that developing theory may make what you guys have produced redundant to some degree. So how do you balance those two?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think by narrative, he or she means sort of biases, is that right? Or your kind of...
I think just kind of like the overall conclusion of the book. So personally, I couldn't actually think of an example from the two, for argument's sake, that I quoted at the beginning of the podcast. But I guess it'd be like, I don't know, saying, it'd be like saying Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji is the perfect Sikh, for argument's sake, and then actually you go and read that he had alcohol so strong that the British called it the devil's breath, and you're like, well, how do those two fit together?
Yeah, so again, it's going to sound really, if it sounds arrogant, I apologize. It's not to be arrogant, but it's like the search for authenticity has always been our kind of watchword. What is real? What is quote unquote true? I'm but also really conscious that everyone has biases and everyone has some viewpoint that comes out, but we try really hard not to, right? And I think part of that is Parmjit and I are quite different in the way that we work. So Parm is, I take kind of a bit of an engineer's, a bit of a Westerner's sort of viewpoint. I want to see evidence, right? I want to see something written down somewhere, something broadly contemporaneous. Otherwise, it can just be fairy stories. Parmjit takes a slightly different view about it. He values oral history much more, right? Particularly when it comes from good sources. I kind of slightly turn my nose up at that sort of stuff sometimes. I'll tell you a really lovely story, right? This goes back, I can't even remember now, 10 years, 12 years ago, something like that. I was just doing like a copy edit In the Master's Presence. So this is just like a read through, I'm just cleaning up bits of English and a few other things. And there's a so you know the story of when Guru Gobind Singh Ji meets Madhur Das, the man who goes on to become Banda Bahadur. And the story they tell, which they had sourced from an old Nihang that they met in Hazur Sahib, it's actually not an uncommon telling, but it's that the Guru goes to the camp, Madhur Das isn't there, and the Guru, what does he do? He sits on his on Madhur Das's kind of dais, his throne, for want of a better word, and he tells his men, slaughter the goats, we're going to eat, right? And of course, Madhur Das is a Vaishnavite, so he's a vegetarian, and so this is an act of phenomenal. This is quite a violent act, right? And then Madhur Das comes back and blah blah blah. But that bit where the Guru is said to have gone into the encampment and told his men to slaughter the goats just felt very wrong to me. It was just a guy. It was like an old Nahang telling the story, right? And it further goes on to say, not only was this an act of kind of violence against Madhur Das and of course the goats, but it was also, because it was an auspicious day, it was like a complete sacrilege to have done this, to slaughter those goats. And the auspicious day was because it was going to be there was a solar eclipse, which are astronomically auspicious. And I said to Palm, I remember writing to him, and I was in a hotel in Italy because I was working. I wasn't working in the UK then. And I messaged him and I said, Palm, you can't put this in. At the very least, you've got to say, Sikh tradition, the Sikh traditional source of this school says this. At the very least, you've got to caveat it, right? And then I went, but actually, if we can prove that a solar eclipse didn't happen, then you can kind of undermine this story completely. Because the solar eclipse would have to have happened in a very thin window of time, because we know exactly when the Guru arrived in Nanded and we know when he died, and so it must have happened between those 2 months, and it had to be visible, obviously, from central India. And I said, if we can prove that in the year of 1708, then you can say whether this story's got any legs or not. So I start Googling around. Historical solar eclipses, Anyway, I'll cut a long story short. That night, I remember I called a couple of places in America and I got bounced around, and then I ended up to this lab in California, if I remember correctly, or Arizona, I can't remember now. And they said, we have mapped every solar eclipse through the centuries, and it's on this website. So you jump onto this website and you can tab back back in time to see not just when they happened, but where they were visible from. Because if you're in India, you're having a very different view of the night sky, or the sky, than you are in the UK, right? Just because of where you're pointed. And they've mapped it. So they've got this global map and they've got this kind of these curves and arcs that show you where things are applicable to. And so you tab back, and I'm going back to 1750, 1740, 1730, 1750, and you get to 1708, October, I'm going to make this date up, I can't remember the precise date, October 1708, October the 7th, and one of these arcs goes right the way through central India, right the way through Maharashtra and Nander, right there. And it's just like jaw-dropping that there is this story which has been held and transferred by, from one person to the other, transmitted orally. And it's absolutely, it's got, at the very least, it's got this kind of confirmation that it was indeed an auspicious time. So why would you not believe that also this other event happened at the same day? And so it was just like this jaw-dropping. I remember writing to him like 2 a.m. or something and saying, Palm, you're never going to believe this. I sent him the screenshot. And if you look in that book, when you look on that page, there's a tiny little footnote. Oh, I think it's not even a footnote. I think it's an endnote. You go to the end of the chapter and you'll see just like 2 sentences. It says, yes, there was a solar eclipse and here's the website you can go to. So keep your mind open, I think is the right thing. And don't dismiss oral histories because I think they're a very important part of the way that our heritage has been transmitted. The ones that you've got to pay particular attention to are those within communities like the Nihangs. I'm sure it happens with the Dasis and others as well, where there's a very strong, almost structured method of transmission of stories and heritage, because I think those prove time and time again to be just really, really good as a written word.
Well, whilst you were recounting that story, I was busy trying to find a book by J.S. Garwal, Guru Gobind Singh Ji's Master of the White Hawk. And the reason that it sparked me to pull that out is because I've just finished reading it and he recounts this, literally what you've just mentioned, in a chapter regarding Banda Singh Bahadur and Guru Gobind Singh Ji. And that story comes from Sarup Singh Koshish's Guru Ki Sakhiyan. So that oral tradition, although it may have existed perhaps prior to the writing of that, that story is literally recounted word for word in Guru Ki Sakhiyan by Sarup Singh Koshish. It says, Guru Gobind Singh Ji sat on Madhu Das's cot waiting for him to arrive. After midday, the langari asked what should be cooked. Maharaj replied, whatever is available in the dera. There was a deer, a goat, and its 2 kids. All 4 were slaughtered for the langar. So, yeah. And it also mentions that it was an auspicious day and it being a solar eclipse. And I've just put in my side notes, science confirms this, and then a big arrow pointing towards the Madra podcast. So thank you for that, definitely. And also anyone listening to it, I just think that providing as much information as we can about whatever we're talking about just helps, because then people can go off and hopefully read it or find out a little bit more. But no, I think what I find really interesting is that you guys, and I think one thing that I really appreciate is that you guys take the oral tradition alongside with the written. And I think you're correct that we often, especially in the West, and it was something that I had a difficulty with during my history degree, because I had a lot of brilliant information coming from people that in my eyes were very reputable and respectable, but it was oral tradition. So it was quite difficult to almost, there is no way of footnoting that really. You're like, oh, so-and-so told me this. And that kind of obviously pushes you to a certain way whilst you're doing your degree, because to be honest, I just wanted to get my grade and jump through the hoops. Like, you're not really bothered about trying to change the system at that point, I don't think. But no, I really think appreciate that. And I think one thing that I like is that it then creates that curiosity to be like, all right, well, I wonder where that came from. And often I think it's just like in the podcast when the Dad Singh, he was like, that is just how it's transmitted in certain cases. But I think in some cases it's really interesting because you can then go and find, well, actually there's a similar recounting here or whatever. Okay, just then moving on, and I think this is probably the kind of the main topic, so to speak, although we've spoken about so much else, which has been brilliant. Which is, so beyond book and exhibitions, your research has obviously seen you influencing real world changes. And I think for me, the most recent one was in relation to the commemoration work regarding the First World War. So before we just carry on with any of that, I just wanted to give you the chance to just explain a little bit about what that is and what went into getting that statement out there and everything that went with it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ahmed. It's so about over a year ago, maybe 2 years ago now, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, which is probably an organisation most people don't really know, but they were set up after the First World War, and the intent was that they would commemorate every single man that died in the First World War, who came from the Commonwealth, so who fought on the side of the sort of Allied or the European powers. So obviously British soldiers, and if you go to any war memorial in the country, that's a Commonwealth War Graves Commission monument. So I think even the cenotaph is considered a Commonwealth War Graves Commission monument, but also the Monte Cassino Cemetery, for example, in Italy, or all of those military cemeteries in northern France and Belgium. They're all CWGC places. India Gate, the big monument in New Delhi opposite the Rashtrapati Bhavan, that's a Commonwealth War Graves Commission site. Because on it carved in there are the names of men who died in the First or Second World War. So its remit now is, of course, First and Second World War, and its stated aim is to commemorate with a grave marker, or with, in the case of people that were cremated, then they generally don't have gravestones, then literally carved in stone, the names of all of the men who died in the First and Second World War. And they've been doing this for, the better part of 100 years. And a few years ago, there was a Channel 4 documentary which took the research work of a Professor Michelle Barrett, which had focused on non-commemoration of basically Black Africans who had served in the Africa Corps, so the equivalent of like the Indian Army, but in parts of East Africa, and had died, and they were not commemorated. And the reasons that they were not commemorated was largely because of racism. Frankly, they just weren't seen as being as valuable lives as the white people that commanded them or served alongside them. And, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that, if you wind back the clock 100 years ago, those attitudes were fairly pervasive. And those attitudes now, of course, are completely unacceptable. So there was a documentary, actually it was directed by a Punjabi guy, John Dior, and it featured David Lammy did the fronting of it. And what it did was it brought to light this kind of academic research, and ultimately led, it took a little while, but it ultimately led to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission saying, all right, fair enough, let's have a proper global look at whether there's more of this that went on, the scale of it, and then what we should do about it. So a couple of years ago, they asked me to join this special committee with about 10 or 15 other people to do an initial kind of bit of research into, is this just confined to those instances, in Africa in the First World War, or is it broader than that? And then is it really to do with notions of racism, or were there just some practical issues, etc.? So the committee worked for about a year. There's some great historians from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission doing much of the work. Then I really picked up the Indian Army as a case study and looked at this phenomenal archive that I've been working on with others over the last 4 or 5 years to see if we could try to build a picture of what happened in India as well. And I think the conclusions of that are fairly clear because they're out in the public domain now. But about a month ago now, we published that report, and the report stated that yes, indeed, there were many tens of thousands of names, or thousands, sorry, of names missing. There's definitely a case to say that we need to do much more research work, because there's a sort of a prima facie case to say that there are a lot more that are missing, not just from the African core, but from India as well. And we don't really know all of the reasons why they are missing in the case of the Indians, but it does look like there are, there could be substantial numbers of names missing. We need to get to the bottom of that. So we definitely need to do more research, and we need to do more. We need to make sure that the commission is kind of ready to accept that it's got to do. It's got to sort of expand its work to include any of those missing names, and then it's got to properly commemorate. It's got to do the thing that it set out to do 100 years ago, which is to commemorate those men. Now, at any time, that's a sensitive conclusion to come to, but it's particularly sensitive because now you can't seem to open a newspaper without some kind of culture war going on, and particularly anything that has empire associated with it seems to put the public into two camps. One camp which is seen as being kind of lefty and woke, a horrible term, and then the other camp which is kind of standing up for British values, and it's just this stupid, uninformed debate. But what I'm particularly pleased about is that this particular report was, previewed to government, previewed to obviously the commission, and actually they took a really sensible and the right approach to it, which was they accepted all of the findings, every single one, all of the recommendations, every single one. And they actually even went further, which I was really surprised about, which was that the Defence Secretary of the UK made a public apology for the fact that they had been missed, and a commitment to correcting that, which is really all you can ask for at this stage. Now another piece of work starts, of course, where we've got to do a little bit more work on the research, which is pretty difficult. But as I said, I've got this phenomenal archive that I've been working on, which would certainly help with the Punjab picture for the First World War. So yeah, it's been an amazing thing to be part of, and unfortunately it's been received in a really mature way.
I think the work that you're doing, we all really appreciate it from the books and the exhibitions, but tend to see your influence in a real world kind of situation like that, I think is really empowering. But just continuing, and this is probably the last, and I would probably argue the most controversial question that I got asked to put forward to you. And it got sent in quite a lot. And I think it exemplifies what you just said about this kind of cultural war, which is everyone wanted me to ask, how do you balance out having an OBE, considering all of the research and everything that you know, and then accepting that? But for some people, it's almost like the empire is bad, therefore having an OBE is bad. Now, what would your response be to that? A lot of people kind of point to the example of Benjamin Zephaniah when he was put up for getting an Order of the Empire, and he said no, and kind of the poem that he released in response. But what would your response be to that?
Yeah, so I've had this question a few times, and I've got immense respect for people that turn down a national honour for that reasons. I'm not trying to engage with their reasons are less superior to my reasons or anything like that. And that'd be wrong. So for me, to be honest, I didn't even think twice when I got offered it. I didn't have any kind of internal agony around it. And I think actually some of that is best articulated if you've been able to read Sutherland's book Empireland, because the framing of empire as either good or either bad is silly. It's really silly. And because 99% of the people listening to this will be thinking, if you are engaging it in that way, will be thinking empire bad, is just read the people that say empire good, and you'll realise how jaundiced that particular view is, right? So the Nigel Biggers of this world, or was that silly book by Jacob Rees-Mogg? It is neither one nor the other. Just like Sikh Empire was neither completely good or completely bad. It is a complicated thing. It is empire complicated, empire not simple, frankly. And I don't see this as being, I don't see having the appellation Order of the British Empire as then being in the club that says empire good. That's absurd. I mean, the thing that we did straight after this was a book on Jallianwala Bagh. It doesn't prevent you taking a topic like that and shedding light on that in a very real way. The thing that I did straight after that was the Special Committee on Commemoration, where we said there was pervasive racism inside, a part of the power structures, if you like, in the UK, which led to non-commemoration of black and brown people. So it doesn't prevent you doing any of that. It doesn't put you into one. I don't see it as being put into one particular camp. Sometimes there's something really nice in his book for those that haven't read it, which I think I'd never really thought about, but actually that does inform part of the reason why I didn't really have any internal conflict about this, which he says that Sicques, peculiarly Sicques, have had a really positive, that empire has had real positives in it, not a net positive or only positives, but have had positives because of empire. We were an exalted community. A lot of the reasons that you are here, and I'm here, and the advancement of Sicques economically is because of empire. I don't always like to admit that, but it's true, right? Why did your dad's parents go to East Africa? Empire. Why are you here and not in Belgium? Empire. Why are you here and not in Punjab? Empire. Why are we seen as being, why are news stories about Sikhs never framed in the way that news stories about Muslims are? Empire. Even there's the Gurban debate in Australia at the moment. You can see the commentary being, oh, this is a tough one. We've got young kids with knives going into schools, but actually they're the all right ones, right? It's empire. It's because of what we did in the First and Second World War. And so, again, it's not to say empire is good. It's just, it's complicated. And there are things that happened which were unspeakably awful, not least of which Jallianwala Bagh. Also just the way that our faith has changed, right? Empire had a real impact on the Christianization of Punjab and the and Christianization of Sikh thinking has meant we almost find native Sikh traditions foreign now. That's also empire as well. Having an OBE doesn't mean that you condone one part of it and condemn the other, or that you're completely positive about the impacts of the British Empire at all. The other thing, once I joked, somebody asked me this question and I sort of joked, if I didn't accept it, my mum would kill me. Ha ha ha. And actually I thought about that on the tube home and I thought, yeah, actually that's true. And not that she wouldn't kill me, but that what a moment, eh? What a moment that my mum and dad, who came here in the 60s as, the same, and treated in very much the same way that sometimes, more recent immigrants like Somalis or whatever are treated nowadays. They weren't, they were teachers in India, but they came here and they became factory workers and ripped off when they were trying to buy their mortgages and really struggled, lived in hostile neighborhoods, couldn't do the things with their kids that they wanted to do. What a moment then, because I took my mum to the thing, the bit when they pin you on. What a moment when we drove through the gates of Buckingham Palace. Just for that, I'd take it. Because it gave her a real feeling that of not even belonging, but just that the state isn't hostile. The state hasn't been hostile. It's actually given her lots of really positive things. And then finally, I was especially pleased that the award was for contribution to Punjabi and Sikh culture and heritage. Really pleased with that, because I think it's actually what the national honour does is it commemorates and acknowledges that Sikh and Punjabi culture and heritage are an important part of the landscape, the cultural landscape of this country. It wasn't an award for community, or I'm not knocking that at all for a second, but I'm just saying the fact that it was an award, a national honour for your contribution to Sikh and Punjabi culture and heritage, just means that we see that we as a nation state see that as being an important, valuable part of the cultural landscape. But yeah, as I said, I didn't really agonize over it at all.
No, and I think you're when you were pointing to the conversation about the Gurban debate that's happening in Australia at the moment, I think that's a really good way of actually exemplifying how it's not so black and white. So I think a lot of the people who kind of sent in this question are also the people who would be pointing to Sikh action in the First World War, the Second World War, when defending Sikhs carrying their Gurbans in Australia. And I just think it's an easy way of highlighting how even kind of trying to take that black and white view just leads to kind of inconsistencies, because you can't be on one hand be like, oh, like, why are you taking this order of the empire? And then also be like, oh yeah, we should keep our Gurban because we fought for the empire. You're like, well, at what point then, like at what point does it, like at what point is the measurement too far and that it's like, oh, that's it, we can't do that or whatever. And I think you're right. Satnam's book is brilliant at bringing out our monolithic understanding of empire and it being X or Y or whatever. But no, thank you for answering that as well.
Well, I think what he does is quite similar to what we do, although he's done it at a different scale. Is not try to be not. I mean, it's everything we've said during this talk. Actually, it's just not try to be black and white about things. It's not, things are not either good or bad. Individual acts are. You can make a moral judgment on them one way or you take something like the broad sweep of 150 years of history and to then give it a grading, say it's a pass fail overall is really silly. It's really silly. Life isn't like that. Our lives are not like that. We do things that we're deeply ashamed of at times and are stupid and are wrong, and then we do things that are right. We don't take a grade at the end of it. You pay for your things that you do badly, and you don't for you get the benefits for the other things. That's just the way it is. But I think right now there is it's a peculiar time at the moment, Ahmed, isn't it, where we are being asked to stay on one side of this battle or the other. I think that time will pass. I really do, but it just seems a really peculiar moment in time.
No, definitely. There's one last question that I've got, and this is just a completely personal one because I remember my dad bought me Sicques, Tigers and Thieves. I think it was probably the first. So I was kind of fortunate enough to grow up in a household where people like Surinder Singh Kohli were close friends with dad, or people like Arvind Mandir were close friends, or people even like yourselves knew one another. And I think I was exposed. And at the time, I had no idea. So I remember going to Surinder Singh Kohli's house, and I just thought he was just Uncle G. And we'd go and see him quite a lot. And only now, kind of growing up, when I'm reading through some of his books, and it's like, oh, signed to my dad, and I'm like, what is going on here? That I realized kind of the weight of some of these people. But Sicques, Tigers, and Thieves really made an impression on me because the Jesuit account of Guru Arjan Dev Ji Shahidi just blew me out of the water. And like you can tell, because I can still tell you about it however many years, 10, 15 years after, or however long it's been since I had the opportunity to read it. Now, and again, this is a question that I get asked, and I'm sure you get asked it all the time, is what other contemporary sources are you aware of in relation to the history of the Gurus? Because I think for me, that was one thing where I went, okay, and I don't mean to say our history isn't real, but in the sense of like when you're at school, you learn so when I was at primary school, we learned about the Romans and the Greeks and all of these ancient civilizations. And it was taught to you in a way where it was almost like they are just people living at a different time. Like it wasn't like, as you said earlier on during the podcast, it's not a fairy tale. And I think a lot of what you're told almost feels when you're growing up almost feels like these are fables or these are stories. And I know a lot of them have kind of originated from somewhere and then developed over time if they've got passed on or they've got kind of sanitized to fit whatever. But reading that Jesuit account was just awesome because it kind of solidified, all right, this is a real history. And it's not just a real history because we say it is. Actually, other people were there to account for it. So are you aware of any other contemporary sources? Are there any other kind of ones that you'd be like, this is where you should go to have a look or whatever?
So yeah, Six Tigers or Thieves was an attempt to try to put them all together as best we could, right? Of that which we had around us. Actually, can I just go back on that point about your dad and the life that, you kind of growing up? So I think I've mentioned this to you before, but I have a memory of being invited to a meeting where I can't remember what we discussed, but it was me, Parmjit, your dad, Arvind Mandar, who's now Professor of Sikh Studies in North America somewhere, Vrinder Kalra, who's in Manchester, Warwick, now, Balbinder Bogle, who's a Professor of Sikh Studies. And what what a moment, eh? I wished I'd taken a picture of that thing because we had this great conversation. We sorted things out and we were going to march on and do all sorts of things. I don't know what happened after that, but there was this kind of interesting meeting point that your dad and those people were trying to set up. Six Tigers or Thieves is a book that attempts to pull together all of the European accounts as best we could for that often hidden period of history. And we were inspired by it because I think it was Bhagwant Singh's book. I might get this wrong, but I think it was Bhagwant Singh's book on a history of the Sikhs that deals with the Missal period in about 9 pages. And he basically kind of went, the Guru died, and then Maharaja Ranjit Singh pops up, and there's this like whole century, this really pivotal century, which he's not able to do much with, and that's because the source material isn't around. So we tried to gather all of the accounts that we could. And so the earliest one is exactly the one you mentioned, the Jesuit account, the letter written by a Jesuit missionary who's kind of attached to the court of Jahangir, and he witnesses or is around when the martyrdom of the 5th Guru takes place. And actually it differs fairly substantially from what is now traditional Sikh telling of that story. And that's I think the opening account, and then it goes all the way out to Malcolm's Sketch of the Sikhs. I think it stops around there. I think actually the title of it, because people often think it's about, thieves and Sikhs or something, is from George Foster's account, which I think is like 1801 or something. So George Foster's one of those, he sort of calls himself a traveller, but he's not really a traveller, he's really a spy. He's kind of trying to understand the Punjab a little bit better. He makes it through, he's diarying himself, or he's writing, it's chronicling what he sees all the way through this thing. And when he's in the Sikh territory, he is feeling under real personal threat because he sits out like a sore thumb. I think he's disguised as a Turkish horse trader or something, but I think they're probably seen through the disguise. So when he exits Sikh territory to relative peace, he writes in his chronicles, unhurt by Sikhs, tigers or thieves, I arrived safely in Nurpur, I think it is. And it's just lovely. It's like there's this moment when often Sikhs feel like we're almost at our weakest because it's between the Gurus and Ranjit Singh. But actually, we're fiercely independent and part of, grabbing power in the Punjab, just as the Mughal power is kind of crashing away. So, but to answer your question, I don't know of any other than those that we've published, but also J.S. Gariwal's excellent book, Sikh History from Persian Sources, and I'm just trying to rack my brains to think how many of those are contemporary, and I don't think too many of them are. Then, of course, there's Bajita Nartak, which is the 10th Guru's writings, which includes poetically a description of what happened to his father. And I think one of the most interesting things that's happening at the moment is that a lot of that material that's written in Braj Bhasha or Hindi or Punjabi or Persian is not just being translated, because of course J.S. Kedawal had a shot at translating it, but it's not just being translated, it's being interpreted. And what Jawala's doing with, Gurpratap, Suraj Prakash, Granth, he isn't just translating it, but he's explaining what those things mean, because you need total cultural awareness of the languages that wrote in, the other things that would have been around him at the time, the other bits in literature would have been around him, and he's interpreting that. And I think what he's doing with Mangalacharan, that his kind of project to take a lot of these old texts like Suraj Prakash or Pant Prakash or any of those kind of Persian accounts, I think if that is supported and resources are in there, then I think that will bring forth all kinds of findings that we didn't have before, because so much, it's not just about translation, it's not just about turning a foreign word into an English word. For people like me and you that perhaps don't have the language skills that he does, it's also about explaining why they wrote what they wrote. There's some great papers on Zafarnama, for example, by Nufanek, where he's taken the Zafarnama and Shahnameh, and putting them together, and then you completely understand then what the 10th Guru is writing about. Because if you just read it in English, it sort of makes sense, but it's also a little bit flowery. But when you realize that the 10th Guru has a detailed understanding of the Persian text Shahnameh and Zafarnama, it blows open the whole letter in a very different way. And Lou is actually closing our 2021 book club with that particular talk. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Nice. That sounds interesting. I'll definitely be looking forward to that too. And I think it's interesting what you said, because I think, and I'm sure you're more than aware, but it's an equally interesting thing with Dasam Granth, because if you don't contextualize it properly, you don't put it in its rightful place in kind of the cultural context and everything else that goes with it, then you can lead to kind of conclusions that don't necessarily hold water. And I think it's interesting, because I think as a community, personally for me, I think the Dasam Granth debate kind of waged on really quite ferociously at one point. I think that's kind of died down now and everyone's kind of gone past it. And I think it's interesting now to see these other kind of lesser known sources of information, so like Suraj Prakash and other such granths being brought to the forefront, and also, as you were saying, not just being translated but explained within the correct context, and everything that goes with it, and all the kind of cultural understanding and language understandings and everything else. And I think I'm really excited to see how this develops, because the more we can understand and the more we know, the better. But it's also just interesting to kind of look at that roadmap and kind of see how we're developing as a community and our understandings kind of progressing alongside that.
You mentioned Dasam Granth at the beginning of that. Your conversation with Gamal on Dasam Granth, I thought was excellent. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. And really kind of goes into not just what it is, and because it always goes down that silly conversation about Charitra, but actually just broadening it out, but also understanding why it's why it's kind of fallen into being almost erased, I think was excellent. And then that is the exact reasons why Suraj Prakash is not with it, because people like Macauliffe, are often cited because he absolutely dismissed it. And Santokh Singh at the same time. And so it just disappears, something that is really important in Sikh understanding in the 19th century and into the 20th century, suddenly, boom, it's gone, and not used at all these days. So it's really nice to see this new generation of historians and linguists bring those back.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to the real world implications that understanding will then have on the community, because equally, I guess we as historians, we look back in time and we're like, oh, for argument's sake, as you're saying, kind of Suraj Prakash is just ignored and it just disappears. And then obviously that obviously would have had then an impact, just like Dasam Granth was dismissed and it disappeared, it had an impact on praxis. Equally, bringing these things back to the forefront, I'm interested to see its impact then on practice and everything else that goes with that. I just wanted to say thank you for everything for today. This conversation's been brilliant. I've like absolutely enjoyed it. I've gone through all of the questions that I had. I just wanted to check if there's anything that you wanted to go over or include, or if there's anything else that you feel we've missed out.
I've really enjoyed this too. Nobody listens to me for this much live, so I'm really, really grateful to you. No, I've got nothing else. I'm happy to do something else again with you if you ever need to, but I think you've probably got more content than you could possibly squeeze into things. So happy to do anything with you again in the future.
No, thank you. No, I'll definitely take you up on that. I think just like with pretty much everyone I've had on the podcast so far, I'm more than happy to sit here and carry on talking. But then I'm also aware that people listening are probably going to turn off a lot quicker than I will stop talking. But no, I'm just absolutely thrilled that we got the chance. I'm really happy that we had this conversation. And again, I would definitely be in touch with kind of future conversations. And equally, if there's anything that I can help with or whatever, like I'm more than happy to kind of put my energy kind of towards whatever you guys are doing. For me, and I said it also with Devinder too, that you kind of Kashi House and everyone kind of associated with that and everything that comes from that has been highly, highly influential in my own development. Like I was doing my history degree at the same time you guys put on the Golden Temple exhibition in Sicques. So for me, it was like brilliantly timed because my second year paper was how far and in what ways did British Raj influence Sikh identity. And so the first time I learned about the Arms Act and them making it illegal for the natives of India to carry arms was through an article that you guys published on GT 1588, the old website. And then obviously I came to the exhibition that blew me out of the water. Everything that you guys have done, I'm just incredibly thankful for, and basically just wish you, as I think you said at the beginning of this podcast, and I think it's a good way of ending it, which is more power to you guys. And all the best really, because I just think the more that we can support people like you guys to do the work you're doing, the better. And I guess it is a little bit sad that people are more occupied with number plates than books, but hopefully through conversations like this, we can hopefully change that.
Hopefully that's not the only message that came out today. But thank you very much. More power to you.
For
thank all the things that you're doing on the podcast, on Twitter, which I really enjoy. I've got to get into these spaces things at some point. And what you do with publishing as well, which I think is very interesting.
No, thank you. Well, I think you touched upon it a little bit when you were saying like in the 90s, it was really difficult. Like there was very limited resource. And I think one thing that I found until I came across the exhibition in my second year of university, one thing that I found really hard was my library at university never had anything. If I needed anything, I had to travel in from Egham into Sicques to get hold of anything worthwhile. And then to try and buy anything, you'd have to get it shipped in from India because it was very difficult to get anything in this country. And then I think kind of the ramblings thing developed organically. Like I got in touch with yourself about family ancestry because that's actually why I started this, because I started to try and map ancestors and realized it's actually really difficult. So started to try and read around it to understand things. And then I was like, well, if I find this interesting, I'm sure someone else will find it interesting. And then I was like, all right, how can I further develop my understanding? And yeah, it's just rolled into this, and to get the support from people like yourself, Devinder Tool, Commonwealth, and everyone else that I've had the pleasure to talk to is just immense. But I think it also goes to show that the community has a common goal. Like everyone is trying to kind of do their bit to preserve kind of heritage in whatever sense that is. But no, thank you so much.
Not at all. It's been enjoyable. All right, take care.